Consideration at the Finance and Expenditure Committee.
The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
The member who's just resumed his seat is generally not a member who you would accuse of letting you die wondering what her opinion was on an issue. She's a woman who has different politics than me, but who does have very strongly held principles and beliefs. And I have never in the past heard her so reluctant to share them. I have never heard a speech by that member which totally ignored the topic of the debate, which is the bill from Rodney Hyde. The member barely gave it a passing glance throughout her entire speech and certainly didn't give any impression, certainly not on the public record, that would leave us in any doubt that she supported it. She was not prepared to commit those words to this bill. If I was Rodney Hyde, I would be spitting tacks at the way he has been treated by this government. What a humiliation to have the confidence and supply agreement that Rodney Hyde signed with John Key. Rodney Hyde signed to John Key. We are going to have this agreement, and I will vote for John Key's legislation, is what Rodney Hyde said, all the way through this term if the National Party agrees to the conditions of the confidence and supply agreement. So what did John Key do with the part of the confidence and supply agreement that said the spending cap people's veto bill would be introduced? When did it say it would be introduced in the confidence and supply agreement, Mr Hyde? Within the first 6 months of the national-led government forming. When was the election? When was the election? I think it was on November the 8th, 2008. November the 8th, 2008. Grant Robertson was elected as the Member of Parliament for Wellington Central that day. That was excellent. That was an excellent move by the fine people of Wellington Central. So that member might help me calculate the 6-month period from that day when he was elected. And Ian Lees-Galloway was also elected as the Member of Parliament for Palmerston North on that day. So 6 months from the 8th of November 2008 is May 2009. Now let's give them a bit of leeway because they didn't form the government the day of the election. So let's give them, say, 3 months leeway. Let's be really generous. That would take us to... That's right. August 2009 is the day that John Key pledged to introduce the spending cap people's veto bill into this House. That is the outside limit, being very generous. What did he do with that confidence and supply agreement to Mr Hyde? That's what he did with it. Worth nothing. Worth nothing. Who cares? So with only 8 sitting days of this Parliament left, the bill is introduced. No wonder Amy Adams gave such a careful speech. How many times did she say in that very short but careful speech, this is an interesting proposal to deal with an interesting issue? That means this is completely out of the ballpark for anything we'd do. We have delayed introducing it for as long as possible. We don't care how embarrassed we have made Rodney Hyde, not nearly as embarrassed as his own party made him, frankly, by having a successful coup for leadership, led by a man who wasn't even a member of the party.
Order.
Extraordinary.
Order.
So this bill is only being introduced and referred to the Select Committee in the dying days of this government, rather than in the 6 months of the forming of the government that was promised in the confidence and supply agreement. Mr Speaker, as my colleague Phil Twyford has said, there are spending caps on government spending in other countries, and we should look, for example, at Japan. They have had a spending cap on government expenditure since the end of World War II. It hasn't stopped them amassing debt equal to 200% of GDP. That's what the level of debt is in Japan, 200% of GDP, because what they do every year is just ask for an exemption from Parliament. I don't propose that as a good idea either. What I suggest, Mr. Speaker, is that our democracy and our Parliament should be robust enough to have those debates for ourselves, not be restricted by some mandatory dream of Rodney Hyde that we would have a spending cap imposed on us, let alone a spending cap when we could just ask ourselves for an exemption, which obviously would be granted, given that the largest party would be leading the government and would have that exemption to the spending cap as part of its confidence in supply agreement. Let's hope that future confidence in supply agreements have more integrity than the one that National signed with Labour. Mr. Speaker, the Member of Parliament for Selwyn, Amy Adams, also spoke about the crippling debt and actually implied that it was left by the last Labour-led government. Well, she should be very careful about what rubbish she puts on the public record, because those facts are available to every single member of the country. When we were elected in 1999, government spending was 30.9% of GDP. 30.9% of GDP. And when we left office at the end of 2008, it was 31.1%. What's the difference between 30.9% of GDP and 31.1%? Not a lot. I think even you would be able to add up. Even that member would be able to add up the difference between 30.9 and 31.1, 2 3/4 years on under National. What is the percentage? What is the percentage now? 36.4% of GDP. So who are the reckless spenders? Who are the reckless spenders? Borrow money, spend up large, cut tax rates for the highest income earners, and at the same time slashing frontline services for New Zealanders from government departments and agencies, particularly in the provincial areas. So this bill isn't what's needed. What is needed is a responsible attitude for government and an ability to tell the truth, because the truth about the level of debt is that it has blown out of control since National was elected. And I'll just repeat those figures for the member who still doesn't understand them. When Labour was elected at the end of 1999, government spending was 30.9% of GDP. When we left office, it was 31.1%. And now, after 2 3/4 years of National, it is 36.4% of GDP. It might be hard for those members to get their heads around those figures, but that is a factual presentation that is based on information that is available to the public and is on the public record. It is hard to understand when we see so many people losing their jobs around the country, so many people, like, for example, in the provincial offices of the Department of Conservation, of Inland Revenue, people who have been available in their local communities to help people with particularly important issues, whether it's in enhancing our local community and environment through the Department of Conservation, whether it's scientists who have been charged with protecting our endangered species, or whether it's the local IRD office, a person who you can approach face to face to help deal with difficult tax issues. Those are the people who are losing their jobs despite the government spending blowing out of control. This is a borrow and spend government. This spending cap, People's Veto's bill, is a nonsense bill, and it deserves to be thrown out.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.